The NTSB just issued the preliminary report on UPS Flight 2976, including shocking images and details about how this happened. And that's why today I'm going to explain what you need to know from this report and also everything that the NTSB isn't saying about this terrible tragedy. I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. On November 4th around 17:14 Eastern Standard Time, UPS Flight 2976, a Boeing MD-11 aircraft was destroyed after it crashed shortly after takeoff from runway 17 right at Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport. Unfortunately, 3 crew members on board the plane and 11 people on the ground were fatally injured. According to the report, UPS Flight 2976 received their takeoff clearance from the tower around 17:11 Eastern Time and the flight crew acknowledged the takeoff clearance. We also know from the earlier press conferences that the NTSB has listened to the cockpit voice recorder and they've confirmed that the pilots completed all their standard checklist and briefings in preparation for the flight and everything was pretty much uneventful until the airplane rotated for takeoff. That being said, the NTSB has not released the transcript from the cockpit voice recorder, and they didn't mention any of those details in the preliminary report. However, what they did include were shocking images from the takeoff. The first image shows the aircraft just beginning to rotate. So, at this point, the crew is committed to taking off, and they probably assumed that this was going to be just another routine flight. Tragically, in the second image you can see the left engine, which is the number 1 engine separating from the aircraft, and it's rotating up to depart over the top of the left wing, which is exactly what these engines are designed to do if they break off. The third picture shows what the NTSB described as a fire igniting on the left engine while it's in the air. And you can also see in this next image that a fire has also ignited near the area of the left pylon attachment to the wing. Now the report goes on to say that the left engine traversed above the fuselage, which is just crazy. And you can see the engine as it's starting to fall towards the ground in this photo. I also want to point out that it appears that the aircraft is starting to yaw to the left because of the loss of thrust on the left side, but the NTSB didn't specifically mention this in the report, and they also didn't provide a timestamp for these images. Either way, all of this probably happened in less than a few seconds, giving the pilots little to no time to react. And the thing that you have to keep in mind is that the pilots can't physically see the engines from where they're sitting at in the cockpit. And it's not clear what kind of indications they got when all of this happened, but what we do know is that a repeating bell started 37 seconds after takeoff thrust was applied. So, most likely that was around the time they started rotating and the engine and the pylon separated from the aircraft. This next image shows the aircraft just a few feet above the ground with a huge fire on the left side near the pylon attachment to the wing. And that fire is going to continue until the aircraft crashed about 25 seconds later. Now, before we talk about what else the NTSB discovered, I think it's worth taking a moment to honor the pilots as well as those on the ground that lost their lives in this terrible tragedy. The NTSB verified that Captain Richard Wartenberg was the pilot monitoring for the flight and he had about 8,600 hours of total flight time with almost 5,000 hours of experience flying the MD-11. Sitting next to him in the right seat was First Officer Lee Trout, who was the pilot flying the aircraft, and he had about 9,200 hours of total flight time with almost 1,000 hours on the MD-11. Also in the cockpit was Captain Dana Diamond, who was serving as the relief officer for the flight. And he had over 15,000 hours of total flight time, including almost 8,800 hours on the MD-11. So, like I've talked about before, this was a highly experienced crew that unfortunately, as you saw from those images, found themselves in a situation where it was impossible to save the aircraft. But the question that everyone is still asking is, how did this happen? And here's what the NTSB has discovered so far. First of all, just to clarify a misspeak that I had in a prior video, the MD-11 involved in this tragedy is a 3-engine wide-body aircraft and it was first delivered to Thai Airways in 1991 in a passenger configuration and later converted to a freighter configuration when it was delivered to UPS in 2006. The NTSB also verified that the aircraft was equipped with GECF-6 engines, which have had a history of uncontained engine failures, but all the evidence that the NTSB has collected and analyzed so far has essentially ruled out that possibility, even though the preliminary report didn't specifically say that. Now, originally there was some confusion regarding how high the aircraft was able to climb on takeoff because the ADS-B data was suggesting it was 475 feet, which was an MSL altitude, but the NTSB has confirmed from the flight data recorder that the aircraft never got higher than about 30 feet above the ground. However, that's pretty much the only information from the flight data recorder that the NTSB has revealed at this time. Next, we know that the aircraft was able to clear the blast fence beyond the end of the runway. And you can see that in this photo showing that the left wing was still on fire when that happened. And in this next image, you can also see where the left main landing gear hit the roof of a warehouse moments before impact. I also want to point out that when it comes to the preliminary report, the NTSB didn't really talk that much about the number 2 or the number 3 engines. And I know there's been some speculation that some of the debris from the left engine could have entered the number 2 engine on the tail and that might have caused a compressor stall. Now, I'll admit that's certainly possible considering that the left engine went up and over the fuselage in front of the number 2 engine. And what's really important to understand is if that happened, then that's the loss of 2 engines at the most critical moment of the takeoff, which is not something that you're going to be able to recover from. I also heard some speculation that the number 3 engine on the right wing might have had a compressor stall, but I don't think that's likely because the left engine would have fallen behind the right wing. But just to be perfectly clear, the NTSB didn't say anything about compressor stalls or the operation of the number 2 or the number 3 engine in their preliminary report. All we know for certain from the facts is that the aircraft struggled to climb, and when the left main gear hit the roof of the warehouse, there wasn't anything they could do to save the aircraft and it continued rolling to the left until impact. Now, one of the things that I thought was interesting about the preliminary report, though, is that the NTSB mentioned the tragedy involving American Airlines Flight 191, which was a DC-10 that crashed on takeoff out of Chicago. That event would turn out to be the deadliest aviation accident in U.S. history, and I made a full video explaining that recently that you can check out on my channel. However, as far as I can tell, the only reason the NTSB mentioned this in the report is just to show that it was a similar event in the sense that the left engine separated from the aircraft during the takeoff. Regardless, going back to the current tragedy with UPS 2976, here's what the NTSB has discovered so far. First of all, you need to know that the left and right engines are attached to the underside of pylons that are in turn attached to the underside of each wing. Now, that pylon essentially has 3 connection points. You've got a forward mount bulkhead, a thrust link assembly, and an aft mount bulkhead. However, the focus right now is primarily on the aft mount bulkhead. And I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible, but some of these details are really important to understand. This is an image of the pylon aft mount bulkhead. And this assembly has 2 fittings that are bolted together, consisting of an aft lug and a forward lug that house a spherical bearing. Then there's also a wing cleave, which is what connects to the pylon aft mount via some attachment hardware. Here's a picture of this assembly on another aircraft showing you the aft and forward lugs are connected to the wing cleave. And that's one of the connection points of the pylon to the wing. According to the report, the forward and aft lugs were found fractured near their 2 o'clock and 9 o'clock positions, which are the inboard and the outboard side of the lugs. And to be clear, those were found near the runway. The left wing cleave and the spherical bearing as well as the attachment hardware along with a portion of the left wing were located near the crash site. Now, when it comes to the right engine, it was still attached to the right wing pylon and it was found at the accident site. And even though the right wing forward and aft mounts had separated from the pylon, they were found about 87 feet away from the right engine, implying that the separation was caused by the impact rather than something else. Going back to the left pylon, this image shows you what it looked like after the NTSB recovered it. And you can see the forward and the aft lugs clearly fractured on the inboard and outboard side. Just like the report talked about, this picture on the left shows you the left wing cleave. And you can see the fractured spherical bearing inside of it compared to the image on the right, which shows you an undamaged spherical bearing just so you can see what that looks like. All that being said, here's where things start to really get interesting. Because remember, the NTSB originally issued an emergency airworthiness directive grounding all MD-11s. And then not long after that, they came out and grounded all DCT-10s as well until further inspections were completed. But now we know the reason for that. You see, here's a much better image of the aft and forward lugs from UPS 2976 along with the cleave and spherical bearing. And what the NTSB discovered was that after they cleaned the surfaces, they found evidence of fatigue cracks. On the aft lug, they found a fatigue crack on both the inboard and outboard surfaces. And when it comes to the forward lug's inboard surface, they found fatigue cracks along the lug bore, but no evidence of fatigue cracking on the outboard surface. Now, I realize a lot of that might sound confusing. So, to try to simplify things, basically what they're talking about is that there were some fatigue cracks on those lugs. And over time, that became an issue to the point where when the pilots went to rotate on takeoff, the stress from that rotation essentially caused those lugs to fracture. And that's what caused the pylon and the engine to separate from the wing. Regardless, the question is, why was there fatigue cracks? And what we know from the maintenance history of the aircraft is that at the time of the accident, the airframe had accumulated about 93,000 hours of flight time and just over 21,000 cycles. And just to clarify, one cycle is one takeoff and landing. The last detailed inspection of the left pylon aft mount took place in October of 2021. And then just recently on October 18, 2025, there was a lubrication of the pylon thrust links and spherical bearings. However, a special detailed inspection of the left pylon aft mount lugs wasn't due until 29,200 cycles, and the wing cleave support was due at 28,000 cycles. So, the NTSB still has a lot of work to do to figure out what caused the fatigue cracking. There's still a lot of questions that need to be answered about this tragedy. Unfortunately, it might take a while before we get the final report, but in the meantime, we need to avoid speculation and let the NTSB do their job. If you want to find out more about what happened to American Airlines Flight 191, be sure to watch this other video on the screen that I made just recently. And I'll see you on the next.